My name is Karenza Philomena. I'm 36 years old, and for most of my adult life, I've been introduced as someone's wife before I was ever introduced as myself. I live in Seattle. I work in healthcare compliance, quietly, precisely, the kind of job where details matter more than volume. I am not dramatic. I am not loud. I don't interrupt people mid-sentence. I don't compete for oxygen in a room. Most people describe me as steady. Some say reserved. A few have said kindly but carelessly harmless. That word always lingers. If you met me at a dinner party, you would probably notice my husband first. He's articulate, confident, charismatic in a way that commands space without asking permission. He has a voice that carries. I have one that waits. And for years, I was comfortable letting him be the visible one, because I have never needed noise to feel powerful. But this story isn't about personality differences. It's about perception. It's about how easily a woman who does not defend herself loudly can be reframed as guilty. It's about what happens when the person closest to you decides your silence is proof of wrongdoing. The title of this video is not exaggerated. My husband accused me of poisoning his reputation until the toxicology report came back. And when it did, the results exposed who had really been playing a dangerous game. I won't give you a scandal. There was no screaming match in the kitchen, no shattered glass, no dramatic courtroom outburst. What happened unfolded slowly, through insinuations, concerned glances, careful conversations that excluded me while claiming to protect him. And then, through data, I am telling this story not because I want revenge, and not because I want sympathy. I am telling it because sometimes justice does not look like triumph. Sometimes it looks like documentation, patience, restraint. Sometimes it looks like letting people underestimate you long enough to reveal themselves. Over the next hour, I'll take you through how I was seen, how I was quietly repositioned as a threat inside my own marriage, and how the truth surfaced, not through confrontation, but through evidence that could not be argued with. This is not a story about destroying someone. It's about refusing to be defined by someone else's narrative. And if you've ever felt yourself slowly mischaracterized in a room you once felt safe in, have you ever wondered what would happen if you stopped correcting them and simply waited? Before I became the woman who poisoned her husband's reputation, I was something far less interesting. I was dependable. In every room I entered, work, family gatherings, neighborhood dinners, I occupied the role of stabilizer, the one who remembered birthdays, the one who followed up on emails, the one who noticed when someone's tone shifted and adjusted mine accordingly. In my marriage, I was the quiet infrastructure. My husband, Adrian, built things publicly. He worked in corporate strategy for a mid-sized tech firm. He was persuasive, assertive, the kind of man people described as decisive. When he spoke, others leaned in. When I spoke, people listened politely, but they rarely quoted me later. And I didn't resent that. I believe partnerships could be asymmetrical in visibility, but equal in value. I handled the details of our life, the taxes, the health insurance transitions, the calendar coordination, the subtle smoothing of social tensions. He handled the networking, the visibility, the momentum. To outsiders, we looked balanced. To his colleagues' spouses, I was grounded. To his friends, I was supportive. To his parents, I was calming. It sounds kind, doesn't it? But there is something dangerous about being universally described in adjectives that imply usefulness rather than presence. No one ever described me as formidable. At work, my role required discretion. I oversaw compliance audits for medical reporting systems. If something went wrong, I was the person who could trace it back. Not dramatically, but methodically. My job depended on precision. Every claim documented, every timestamp is preserved. Adrian used to tease me about my paper trails. "You could build a case against a ghost," he'd say, smiling. I thought it was admiration. What I didn't understand at the time was that my invisibility had become comfortable for everyone, including him. When people underestimate you, they do it gradually. It starts as convenience. You're the flexible one. The patient is one, the reasonable one. And because you don't protest loudly, the narrative settles around you like dust. At dinner parties, if Adrian spoke over me, I would simply pause and continue later. If he reframed something I'd said as if it were his own thought, I would let it pass. I told myself it didn't matter who received credit as long as the idea landed. I told myself maturity meant not competing. Looking back, I can see how easily that posture could be rewritten. Because when conflict finally entered the room, when doubt began to circulate, the template was already there. Karenza is quiet. Karenza doesn't defend herself loudly. Karenza keeps things to herself. And when someone keeps things to herself, it's easy to imagine she might be hiding something. I didn't know then that the same traits that made me steady would later be described as secretive, or that the man who once joked about my documentation skills would eventually suggest that I was manipulating narratives behind his back. But at that point in our story, I was still the reliable one, the calm one, the woman no one felt threatened by. And sometimes the most dangerous position to occupy is the one where no one thinks you're capable of doing anything at all. The first accusation did not sound like an accusation. It sounded like confusion. Adrian came home later than usual that evening. Not dramatically late, just late enough that dinner had cooled and the air between us felt slightly rearranged. He placed his keys on the counter with a care that felt deliberate. "I had an odd conversation today," he said, loosening his tie. I remember the exact way the light hit the kitchen backsplash. I remember because something in his tone made my body catalog the moment. "About?" I asked. He hesitated. Not long, but long enough to suggest calculation. "Apparently," he said slowly, "someone mentioned that I've been difficult lately." I waited. He watched my face carefully, not in anger, in assessment. "They said it sounded like I've been defensive in meetings, a little combative, and that it might be personal." The word lingered. I've worked in compliance long enough to recognize framing. When someone says apparently, they are testing ownership. When someone says someone mentioned, they are gauging a reaction. "And why would that be personal?" I asked gently. He shrugged. "That's the strange part. They implied something about conversations happening outside of work, about concerns being shared." I felt it then, a faint, almost imperceptible shift, like the smallest paper cut across the surface of trust. "Are you asking if I have spoken to someone?" I asked. "I'm just trying to understand," he replied. Calm, reasonable, measured. It would be odd if narratives were forming without my knowledge. Narratives. I remember that word clearly. I hadn't spoken to anyone about him. I had mentioned once, at a dinner with two other couples, that work stress seemed heavier on him lately. Not critically, not confidentially, simply observationally. But in that moment, the suggestion hung between us as if I'd orchestrated something larger. "I haven't said anything that would harm you," I told him. He nodded, slowly. "I didn't think you would," he said. "Didn't think. Don't think." It was small. So small that if you were watching from the outside, you would miss it entirely. There was no raised voice, no slammed cabinet door. He even kissed my forehead before heading upstairs. But something had been introduced into the room. The idea that I might be influencing how others saw him. And what unsettled me most was not the accusation itself. It was how carefully it was delivered. Over the next few days, the theme repeated in subtler ways. "Did you talk to Melissa recently? Have you mentioned my project timeline to anyone? Just curious. Who have you been texting about work stuff?" Each question wore the costume of curiosity. And because I value clarity, I answered directly every time. No defensiveness, no counter-accusation. But I began to notice something unsettling. He wasn't asking to understand. He was asking to confirm a suspicion he had already allowed to form. The first small cut in a relationship isn't betrayal, it's reframing. It's when one person begins quietly testing whether the other might be the source of a problem. And what makes it dangerous is how reasonable it sounds. If I had reacted emotionally, perhaps the narrative would have escalated immediately. But I didn't. I responded the way I always did, calmly, factually, which in hindsight may have made it easier for him to think I was capable of something calculated. Because when someone is composed, people sometimes mistake that for concealment. I told myself it would pass, that stress at work was amplifying paranoia, that this was a season, not a shift. But that night, as I opened my leather planner and wrote down a routine reminder for the following week, I found myself adding a note I'd never needed before. Adrian, conversation, meeting perception. It was a simple line. Just documentation. At the time, I didn't know I had just started a record, and I certainly didn't know how important it would become. There is a specific kind of erosion that doesn't feel like damage at first. It feels like an adjustment. After that first conversation, Adrian didn't accuse me outright. He didn't confront me with evidence. Instead, he began adjusting his tone in small, almost invisible ways. He would pause before answering me. He would rephrase things I'd said as if clarifying inconsistencies that weren't there. He began prefacing statements with, "Just to be transparent." Transparency implies a prior lack of it. At first, I told myself this was stress. His company was undergoing restructuring. Leadership reviews were tense. It would make sense for him to feel scrutinized and to project that scrutiny outward. But projection has a pattern. One evening, we attended a small gathering with colleagues and their partners. It was the kind of casual rooftop event where people hold stemless glasses and talk about quarterly forecasts as if they're discussing the weather. Someone mentioned internal friction within Adrian's team. Before I could say anything, he laughed lightly and said, "Well, you know how narratives travel." There was a glance, subtle, brief, and then he added, "Sometimes the people closest to you don't realize how their words can ripple." It was delivered as humor, but the air shifted. Two people looked at me, not accusingly, but curiously. And in that moment, I understood something important. He wasn't confronting me privately anymore. He was planting ambiguity publicly. Not enough to accuse, just enough to suggest. On the drive home, I asked him directly, Did that comment have something to do with me? He exhaled slowly. I just think we should both be careful, he said. Reputations are fragile. Both. That word settled in my chest like a weight. The most destabilizing part wasn't anger. It was plausible deniability. If I reacted strongly, I would appear defensive. If I stayed silent, I appeared complicit. So I chose what I had always chosen: composure. I rationalized it. Marriage requires patience. Stress amplifies suspicion. Don't escalate what can dissolve on its own. And besides, I told myself, if I truly had nothing to hide, clarity would eventually win. But something else was happening quietly beneath that logic. Each time he implied that information had leaked, he stopped sharing certain details with me. Not obviously, not in a punitive way, he simply withheld. Meeting updates became vague. Names disappeared from stories. Timelines were blurred. If I asked follow-up questions, he would smile and say, it's probably better if you're not in the middle of it. Not in the middle of what? I began to see the role forming around me. Not partner, not confidant. Potential liability. And here's the part I'm not proud of. I normalized it. I told myself he was protecting me from workplace politics. I told myself distance could be temporary. I told myself that insisting on transparency might look like insecurity. So I adjusted. I asked fewer questions. I volunteered for less observation. I became even quieter. And the quieter I became, the easier it was for him to suggest that I operate independently of him. Silence is neutral only in theory. In practice, silence is a canvas. Other people will paint on it. What unsettled me most was not that he doubted me. It was that he seemed comfortable letting others doubt me too. Not directly, never directly, just enough. And each time I chose not to confront it, I was reinforcing a version of myself that could eventually be recast as secretive. Looking back, that was the turning point I didn't recognize. Disrespect rarely arrives as an insult. It arrives as a suggestion, as an implication, as humor with an edge. And if you're careful, patient, and unwilling to cause a scene, you can accidentally teach someone that your silence has no limit. It took me longer than I care to admit to recognize the role I had been gently placed into. It wasn't a villain, not yet. It was something subtler. I was becoming the unintended source, the well-meaning but careless wife, the quiet observer who didn't realize how much she influenced conversations, the person who might not understand the stakes of corporate dynamics. One afternoon, Adrian came home unusually early. He set his laptop down on the dining table instead of his office desk. That, by itself, meant something. I've decided, he began, that it's probably better if I compartmentalize work a bit more. I waited. It's not that I don't trust you, he added quickly. I just think we both benefit from clearer boundaries. There it was again. Trust is mentioned preemptively. I asked him what had prompted this. He explained that during a leadership check-in, someone referenced external chatter. He couldn't specify what was said. He couldn't identify the source, but he emphasized that perception was forming. And perception becomes reality, he said. In that moment, I realized something unsettling. I was being positioned as a variable in a system I didn't even participate in. Not accused directly, just accounted for. At dinner with his parents the following weekend, his mother asked how his projects were going. He smiled tightly. Oh, trying to keep things contained. Contained. His father chuckled and said, you have to watch who you confide in. It was subtle, a passing comment, but it landed. I glanced at Adrian. He didn't correct it. He didn't clarify. He let the assumption sit. That was when the clarity came. Not explosive, not dramatic. Just sharp. I had been assigned a role without ever consenting to it. The supportive wife who might accidentally leak stress. The quiet woman who listens but perhaps talks later. The stabilizer who could now be reframed as destabilizing. And because I didn't argue loudly, because I didn't defend myself publicly, the role felt believable. I thought back to every moment I'd chosen grace over correction. Every time I'd let him interrupt me. Every time I'd allowed credit to shift casually in his direction. Those weren't weaknesses, but they had created a pattern. I would not contest narratives in real time, which made me safe to reposition. The strange part was this: I didn't feel angry. I felt observed, as if someone had begun studying me from a distance, trying to determine how much I knew. Because I did know something. I knew I hadn't done what he was implying. And I also knew something else, something more dangerous. In my profession, vague accusations without documentation don't survive long, but in personal relationships, they can linger indefinitely. That night, after he went to sleep, I opened my planner again. This time, I didn't just jot a note. I created a section. Dates, conversations, witnesses present, exact wording, when possible. Not because I intended to confront him. Not yet. But because, for the first time, I sensed that the role I'd been assigned might eventually require evidence to dismantle. And if I were going to be quietly cast as a risk, I needed to understand exactly when the script began. I didn't know how far this would go, but I knew something had shifted. I was no longer just being underestimated. I was being prepared for something. The shift did not happen during an argument. It didn't happen during one of his careful, measured conversations about perception. It didn't happen in front of friends or family. It happened on a Tuesday morning. Quiet, ordinary, almost forgettable. Adrian had left early for a quarterly strategy session. I was working from home that day, reviewing audit summaries. Around 10:30, my phone buzzed. It was a message from Melissa, one of the spouses from our social circle. Not someone I confided in deeply, just friendly. Hey, random question. Did you talk to anyone about Adrian's leadership review? I stared at the screen. No, I typed up. There was a pause. Then, someone mentioned you were concerned about his stress levels and thought he might not be coping well. I felt the air change in the room. Concerned about stress? Yes, I had said that once, months ago, in a context so benign it barely qualified as commentary. But leadership review? Coping? That wasn't the language I used. I didn't say that, I replied carelessly. Another pause. Oh, she wrote. That's strange. It was framed as it came from you. Framed. That word again. I didn't respond immediately. Instead, I opened my planner. I flipped back 3 months. Dinner with 2 couples. Light conversation about work-life balance. I had said, I think he's been under a lot of pressure lately. That was it. No speculation, no critique. I closed the planner slowly. For the first time, a new possibility entered my mind. Not that Adrian misunderstood me, but that something was being constructed. When he came home that evening, he seemed unusually tense. His movements were clipped, efficient. How was your day? I asked. He exhaled sharply. Complicated. I waited. There's this ongoing narrative, he said, pacing slightly, that I'm unraveling, that I'm defensive because of personal instability. Personal instability. And where would that narrative originate? I asked evenly. He stopped pacing, looked at me directly. That's what I'm trying to understand. The implication was no longer subtle. And you believe it could be me? I asked. I don't know what to believe, you reply, he replied. But the pattern is concerning. Pattern. That was the moment something shifted inside me. Not anger, not panic, clarity. Because patterns, in my world, require data. They require consistency. They require source verification. And I suddenly understood that while I had been documenting conversations privately, he may have been constructing a storyline publicly. If I reacted emotionally, it would confirm instability. If I argued defensively, it would reinforce secrecy. So I did something different. I asked a question. Adrian, I said softly, have you considered that the narrative might not be coming from outside our marriage? He frowned. What does that mean? It means, I continued steady, that if someone believes you're unstable, it could be because of something you've communicated, directly or indirectly. The room went still. It wasn't an accusation, it was a possibility. And in that stillness, I saw something I hadn't seen before. Not guilt. Fear. Not fear of me. Fear of exposure. He recovered quickly. That's unfair, he said. I've been transparent. Transparent. But transparency doesn't protect you from distortion. That night, after he went to bed, I didn't just write in my planner. I began organizing emails, calendar invites, text messages, screenshots. Not obsessively, not desperately, methodically, because the shift I felt wasn't about proving innocence. It was about preparing for impact. For the first time, I understood that this might not dissolve on its own. And for the first time, I stopped hoping it would. Silence was no longer just patience. It was positioning. There is a difference between staying quiet because you trust someone and staying quiet because you are studying them. After that Tuesday, my silence changed. Externally, nothing dramatic shifted. I still asked about his day. I still attended dinners. I still sent polite follow-up messages after social gatherings. If anything, I appeared even calmer. Internally, I stopped explaining myself. When Adrian made vague references to feedback he'd received, I no longer rushed to defend. I would nod, ask for specifics, and let the absence of them linger. Who said that? What exactly was quoted? On what date? The more precise my questions became, the more abstract his answers grew. And abstraction is fragile. He began interpreting my composure differently now. Where once he might have mistaken it for softness, he started treating it as distance. You've been detached, he said one evening. I've been listening, I replied. He didn't like that answer. Silence, when chosen intentionally, unsettles people who rely on reaction. At social gatherings, I noticed something subtle but important. He had begun telling a new version of our dynamic. Lightly, carefully. Carenza prefers to stay out of the drama, he would say. She's very private. She processes things internally. All technically true. But tone shapes truth. It wasn't that he was accusing me publicly. He was preconditioning the audience, establishing that if something surfaced, my quiet nature would make it believable. And I let him, not because I agreed, but because I needed the pattern to fully reveal itself. In my profession, you never interrupt a process midstream unless absolutely necessary. You observe first, you map influence, you identify leverage points. So I observed he had stopped sharing certain updates with me, but I still had access to the broader environment. Through casual conversation, through neutral questions, through timing inconsistencies. I noticed that on days he claimed meetings ran late, there were no calendar adjustments visible in shared invites. I noticed that certain colleagues who once greeted me warmly now approached me with cautious politeness. Not hostility, just recalibration, as if they were unsure whether I was trustworthy. That was when I understood the real danger. He wasn't accusing me of a specific act. He was allowing ambiguity to grow around my character. And ambiguity is far more damaging than a direct claim. If someone calls you dishonest, you can refute it. If someone implies you are unpredictable, people begin adjusting before asking. One night, while reviewing compliance documentation for work, I paused over a phrase in a policy manual. Reputation damage often precedes evidence of misconduct. I stared at that sentence longer than I should have, because in that moment, I realized something unsettling. Adrian may have been anticipating scrutiny himself. If whispers were circulating about instability, defensiveness, or erratic leadership, redirecting that instability toward me would protect him, not through blame, through suggestion. And suggestion is almost impossible to confront without appearing reactive. So I chose something different. I stopped correcting narratives in small ways. If someone joked that I was mysterious, I smiled. If someone implied I kept things to myself, I agreed calmly. I let the description settle, because the more exaggerated the image became, the more measurable it would be against reality. Silence, when used carelessly, erodes you. Silence, when used deliberately, reveals others. He mistook my restraint for passivity. He thought my lack of confrontation meant a lack of awareness. But what he didn't realize was this. I was no longer trying to win the conversation. I was preparing for the moment when conversation would no longer matter. Preparation rarely looks dramatic. It looks like routine. After my silence became intentional, my life appeared unchanged from the outside. I still went to work. I still hosted small dinners. I still sent birthday gifts on time. I still kissed my husband goodbye in the morning. But beneath that normalcy, I began doing something very specific. I started tracing origin points, not just of comments, but of timing. When did the first mention of his defensiveness surface? Who repeated it? In what language? Because language leaves fingerprints. Through casual conversations, I noticed something consistent. The phrasing people used to describe Adrian's supposed instability matched phrases he had used at home. Under pressure, taking things personally, emotionally reactive. These were not words I used. They were words he used to describe himself, jokingly at first, almost theatrically. I'm becoming that guy, he once said. The intense one. At the time, I thought it was self-awareness. Now I wasn't so sure. I didn't accuse, I didn't confront. Instead, I asked neutral questions at neutral times. To a colleague's spouse, has Adrian mentioned anything about restructuring? To a mutual friend, how does he seem lately? Busy? And what I received back wasn't hostility toward me. It was a concern for him. He seemed stressed. He mentioned feeling misunderstood. He said even at home things feel tense. At home, that word echoed. I began compiling timelines, not obsessively, but systematically. I cross-referenced dates when he claimed rumors surfaced with dates he had private meetings. I noted when he began withdrawing certain information from me. Then I noticed something even more revealing. The first time someone suggested that I had voiced concerns about his coping ability occurred 2 days after a specific leadership review he'd been anxious about. 2 days, not weeks, not months. And the phrasing used by Melissa, not coping well, matched something he had said verbatim one night at dinner. I don't think I'm coping well with this restructuring, he'd admitted softly. I had responded with empathy. No witnesses, no repetition. Yet somehow the language had reappeared in circulation. Attached to me, that was when the structure of the game became visible. If leadership perceived him as unstable, there had to be a source, a reason, an explanation. And what safer explanation than a concerned wife talking too freely? It reframed vulnerability as sabotage. I didn't celebrate this realization. Clarity isn't comforting when it reveals betrayal, but clarity is stabilizing. I began organizing my documentation more formally, not just in my planner, but digitally. I created time-stamped summaries of conversations, archived messages, stored calendar exports. Not because I intended to present them publicly, but if the narrative escalated, I would not rely on memory. I also made one quiet decision no one noticed. I scheduled my annual health checkup earlier than planned. Routine blood work, standard panels. It seems unrelated. It wasn't, because around that same time, Adrian began mentioning feeling physically unwell. Headaches, fatigue, nausea. He joked once, half smiling, maybe I'm being slowly poisoned by stress. Everyone laughed, including me, but I filed the sentence away. When physical symptoms begin appearing alongside reputation shifts, the terrain changes. I didn't assume anything. I didn't accuse him of fabricating symptoms. I simply recognized a pattern emerging: instability at work, stress at home, physical decline. A narrative was forming. And narratives, when constructed carefully, can culminate in accusations that feel inevitable. They never noticed what I was doing, because what I was doing looked like composure, but underneath that composure was alignment. Data, dates, language, motive. I wasn't building a case against him. I was building insulation around myself. Because if the story reached its logical endpoint, I wanted to be ready for it. The accusation did not begin in our home. It began in a clinic. Adrian had been complaining of worsening symptoms for weeks. Persistent headaches, stomach discomfort, waves of fatigue he described as chemical. That was his word. Chemical. At first, I encouraged rest, hydration, a medical consultation. I even offered to schedule it myself. He declined twice. Then one afternoon, he came home pale and unusually quiet. I went to urgent care, he said. Odd. I felt my pulse steady instead of spiking. What did they say? They're running tests, he replied, with blood work, toxicology screening. The word landed heavily between us. Toxicology. I didn't react visibly. I asked the appropriate questions. When would results return? Did the doctor suspect anything specific? Was he dehydrated? He watched my face the entire time. Not for comfort, for tells. 2 days later, he sat across from me at the kitchen table with a printed sheet of paper in his hand. They found elevated levels of something, he said carefully. Not lethal, but abnormal. Of what? I asked. He didn't answer directly. The doctor asked about possible exposure, environmental, dietary. He paused. And he asked who prepares most of the meals. There it was. Not an explosion, a placement. My reputation is already unstable at work, he continued slowly. If this becomes something else. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. My husband accused me of poisoning his reputation until the toxicology report came back. But in that moment, it wasn't yet about reputation. It was about implication. He didn't say, "You poisoned me." He said, "This looks bad." And what he meant was, this could be framed. The room felt unnaturally still. "Do you believe I would harm you?" I asked. His eyes flickered, just slightly. "I don't know what to believe anymore," he said. "There is a specific kind of betrayal that arrives not through rage, but through hesitation." I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. Instead, I asked, "May I see the report?" He hesitated again. Then he slid the paper across the table. I read it carefully, twice. The substance listed was not a common household poison. It was a compound sometimes found in over-the-counter supplements when improperly dosed. Elevated, but not extreme. And below that line, something else caught my eye. A notation. Possible cross-reactivity. Recommend confirmatory retest. Possible cross-reactivity. In compliance work, that phrase is everything. It means the result might not mean what it appears to mean. When is the confirmatory test? I asked promptly. They didn't schedule one yet, he said. They wanted to review lifestyle factors first. Lifestyle factors. Translation, proximity, access, opportunity, and in the emerging narrative, I had all three. What he didn't realize in that moment was this. I had already scheduled my own full blood panel the week before. Routine, unrelated, but now suddenly relevant. And I had something else he didn't expect. Receipts, digital grocery logs, time-stamped meal deliveries, archived calendar entries, showing nights he ate out alone during the exact window his symptoms supposedly intensified. I didn't mention any of it. Not yet. Instead, I looked at him steadily and said, "Schedule the confirmatory test." He blinked. "And until those results come back," I added quietly, "let's not construct conclusions." The results exposed who had really been playing a dangerous game. But at that moment, the game was still unfolding. And I finally understood its shape. This wasn't about my silence anymore. It wasn't even about work perception. It was about escalation. If his leadership questioned his stability, and if physical symptoms supported that instability, and if proximity created suspicion, then the narrative would evolve from, his wife talks too much, to, his wife might be dangerous. And that kind of narrative doesn't just damage reputation. It isolates. He thought the toxicology result gave him leverage. What he didn't know was that incomplete data is never leveraged against someone who understands documentation. I folded the paper neatly and slid it back to him. "I'll be here when the full report comes in," I said. No accusation, no panic, just patience. Because if there was one thing I trusted more than emotion, it was evidence. There is always a moment when you realize the situation in front of you is no longer a misunderstanding. It is a fork in the road. After the preliminary toxicology result, the air in our home changed. Not dramatically, not in a way neighbors would notice, but subtly, unmistakably. Adrian began locking his office door. He stopped eating meals I prepared, politely, of course. "I'm just being cautious," he said, "until we understand what's happening." Cautious. The word implies risk, and in that implication, I could feel the role solidifying around me. At work, I maintained normalcy. At home, I maintained composure. But inside, I was calculating options. Option 1, Confront him directly, demand clarity, insist he admit what he was implying. But confrontation without proof would escalate emotion, not truth. Option 2, leave. Remove myself from the environment entirely. But leaving under suspicion would cement the narrative he was allowing to grow. Option 3, wait quietly for the confirmatory test and hope it clears everything. Hope is not a strategy. Then there was option 4, irreversible. Not explosive, not dramatic, strategic. I scheduled a consultation with a family law attorney, not to file immediately, not to threaten, to understand. I brought no accusations, only documentation. Dates of conversations, screenshots of texts, grocery logs. My own recent blood work results showed no abnormalities. A copy of his preliminary toxicology report with the cross-reactivity notation highlighted. The attorney listened without interruption. When I finished, she asked a single question. Has he explicitly accused you? No, I said. Has he implied you could be responsible? Yes, she nodded slowly. And are others beginning to perceive you that way? I thought of the rooftop party, of Melissa's message, of his parents' subtle comments. Yes. She closed the folder gently. Then you are not dealing with a medical issue, she said calmly. You are dealing with narrative positioning. The phrase landed like confirmation. If the confirmatory test comes back negative, she continued, and the abnormality is explained by something unrelated to you, you will have evidence. If it doesn't, you still have evidence of procedural gaps. Procedural gaps. I understood those intimately. What would you advise? I asked. She didn't hesitate. Secure your financial independence quietly. Separate accounts. Protect digital access. Do not confront until you have final data. It wasn't revenge. It was insulation. I went home that afternoon and made no visible changes. But behind the scenes, I opened a separate account. I ensured my income deposits could be redirected within minutes. I updated passwords, not dramatically, just prudently. And I did one more thing. I requested, directly from the clinic, a copy of the full toxicology panel and confirmation schedule. When Adrian asked why, I answered plainly, because this involves me. He looked at me differently then. Not with anger, with uncertainty. He had expected defensiveness, tears, perhaps denial. He hadn't expected procedural involvement. The confirmatory test was scheduled for the following week. 7 days. 7 days where suspicion floated unspoken between us. I watched him carefully during that week. He seemed restless, irritated, at times almost anxious for the results. Not afraid of being poisoned, afraid of something else. And in those quiet days, I made my decision. If the final report exonerated me, as I believed it would, I would not simply resume normal life. Because the accusation itself was the rupture. Even if it dissolved medically, it would not dissolve relationally. Trust, once redirected toward suspicion, does not automatically revert. The decision I chose was not dramatic, it was final. When the truth arrived, I would respond not with emotion, but with consequences. The week before the confirmatory test results came back felt suspended in glass. Nothing shattered, nothing resolved. Adrian moved carefully around me, as if I were fragile, or volatile, or both. He ordered takeout for himself. He washed his own dishes. He stopped leaving his coffee unattended. Not an accusation, in performance. And I understood then that this was no longer just about us. It was about optics. If anyone ever asked later, he would be able to say, I was cautious, I was responsible. So I let him be cautious. In the meantime, I moved. Not loudly, not recklessly. Strategically, I finalized the separation of my finances. Not a dramatic withdrawal, just a clean rerouting of my salary into the new account the attorney had advised. I ensured my retirement contributions remained untouched. I copied important tax documents into encrypted storage. Then I scheduled something else. A consultation with an independent toxicologist. Not to challenge the clinic, not to escalate. To understand. I brought the preliminary report. I brought the notation about cross-reactivity. I brought a list of supplements Adrian had mentioned taking, protein powders, stress adaptogens, and a nootropic blend he'd recently started. The toxicologist reviewed the document quietly. This compound, he said, tapping the page, can show elevated levels if certain supplements metabolize unpredictably, especially if mixed. Mixed with what? I asked. Alcohol, other compounds, or inconsistent dosing. I held his gaze. Could it be introduced through food? Possible, he said, but unlikely without sustained exposure at higher levels. Sustained exposure, higher levels, neither of which appeared in the report. And the cross-reactivity? I asked. He nodded. It's common enough that confirmatory testing is standard. You don't conclude intent from this. Intent. That word mattered more than the chemical. I thanked him and left without visible emotion, because now I understood something Adrian did not. Even if the confirmatory test came back abnormal again, the level documented did not support deliberate poisoning. It supported mismanagement, supplement misuse, stress, perhaps even self-inflicted inconsistency. What unsettled me most was this. He knew what he was taking. I had seen the containers. I had asked casually about them. He had laughed and said, "Just optimizing." Optimizing. I returned home that afternoon and found him on the phone, pacing. "I just need clarity," he was saying. "If something external is affecting me, I need to know." External. When he saw me, he lowered his voice. That night, he asked me a question that almost sounded vulnerable. "If this turns out to be nothing," he said carefully, "can we just move forward?" Nothing, as if the implication itself was disposable. I looked at him steadily. "We will move forward, as I said." I didn't specify together. The confirmatory results were scheduled to be released the following morning electronically. I slept deeply that night, not because I wasn't afraid, but because I was prepared. Whatever the report said, I now understood the full architecture of the situation. If it cleared me, I would have documentation of implication. If it didn't, I would have expert analysis challenging causation. Either way, the ambiguity he had relied on was collapsing. He believed silence had protected him. He didn't realize silence had fortified me. The next morning at 8:17 a.m., my phone vibrated. The results were in. The confirmatory report was only 3 pages long. Clinical, precise, undramatic. I opened it before Adrian woke up. The previously elevated compound had normalized. The notation read, "Initial elevation likely due to cross-reactivity or supplement interference. No evidence of toxic exposure." No evidence of toxic exposure. I read it twice, then a third time. Not because I doubted it, because I understood what it dismantled. By 8:42 a.m., Adrian was in the kitchen, scrolling through his phone. I watched the moment his posture changed, the slight tightening of his shoulders as he opened the same report. Silence filled the space between us. "Well," he said finally, forcing a breath that sounded almost like relief. "That's good." "Good." I nodded. "Yes," I said calmly. It is." He poured coffee, avoided my eyes, set the mug down too carefully. "So it was probably just the supplements," he added quickly. "Or lab variants." "Probably." There was no apology, no acknowledgement of what had been implied, just an eagerness to compress the week into something forgettable, as if the accusation had been theoretical, as if suspicion had not entered our home. But consequences don't always arrive as punishment. Sometimes they arrive as recalibration. By mid-morning, something else began to unfold. A colleague's spouse texted me. "Hey, Adrian mentioned the test was clear. That must be a relief." Mentioned. He had already started managing the narrative. But this time, the story couldn't hold. Because clarity spreads differently than suspicion. Within days, subtle shifts became visible. At a small gathering that weekend, someone joked lightly about stress supplements backfiring. Adrian laughed, but the laugh was thin. Another colleague asked him directly, "So it wasn't environmental after all?" "Environmental." The word lingered. I watched him answer. "No," he said carefully. "Just miscalculation." Miscalculation. That word didn't just apply to supplements. It applied to strategy. Because while he had allowed ambiguity to circulate about me, he had also allowed concern about his own stability to deepen. And now, with the toxicology cleared, attention recalibrated. If his instability wasn't caused externally, then it was internal. Over the next week, I noticed something else. He was quieter in social settings, less expansive, more guarded. Not toward me, toward everyone. The narrative he had gently seeded had begun to bend back toward him. Not dramatically, not maliciously, just logically. If there was no poisoning, if there was no external influence, then what explained the defensiveness at work? The stress, the symptoms. Reputation is fragile. He had been right about that, but he had miscalculated where fragility truly lived. At home, he attempted normalcy. He cooked dinner one evening, asked about my day with exaggerated attentiveness, suggested we reset. But resets require acknowledgement, and acknowledgement had not come. He never said, "I was wrong." He never said, "I'm sorry I implied harm." Instead, he behaved as if relief should be enough. But relief is not repair, and in the quiet recalibration that followed, something irreversible had already occurred. He had introduced this possibility that I was dangerous. The report had removed the chemical, but it had not removed the fact that he was willing to let that possibility exist. And once someone sees you as capable of harm, even briefly, you see them differently forever. Relief lasted exactly 48 hours. After that, something else replaced it. Not gratitude, not humility, control. Adrian began trying to smooth the narrative aggressively. He sent follow-up emails to colleagues clarifying that the toxicology was a false alarm. He framed it as a health scare exaggerated by lab variability. But the more he explained, the more he reinforced that there had been something to explain. And explanations invite questions. At home, he shifted tactics. "I think this whole thing just shows how stressed we both are," he said one evening. "Maybe we've both contributed to misunderstandings." Both. Again, there is something psychologically strategic about shared blame. It dilutes responsibility without admitting fault. "What misunderstandings did I contribute to?" I asked calmly. He hesitated. "Well, maybe we've both been distant." Distance is not an accusation. Distance is not implication. Distance is not allowing others to wonder whether your wife might be responsible for unexplained symptoms. But he needed symmetry. Without symmetry, he stood alone in the miscalculation. Over the next week, his tone grew subtly sharper. "You've been documenting things, haven't you?" he asked one night. I didn't flinch. "I document everything," I replied. "You know that." He watched me carefully. "Why?" "Because clarity matters." He didn't like that answer. The panic didn't arrive in the form of shouting. It arrived as unpredictability. Small irritations, short responses, a new defensiveness when I asked ordinary questions. The confirmatory report had cleared me, but it had also cornered him. Because now the only remaining explanation for the instability narrative was him. His leadership review, I later learned through indirect conversation, had not gone well. Concerns about temperament, emotional regulation, strategic alignment. And without an external explanation, without a concerned wife subtly undermining him, the feedback stood unbuffered. He tried once more to rewrite the emotional landscape. "We've both been under pressure," he said, softer this time. "Let's not let this ruin us." Ruin. The word felt misplaced. This wasn't ruined. It was a revelation. "You allowed the possibility that I was harming you," I said quietly. Not angrily, just factually. "I never said that." "You didn't need to." Silence stretched. In that silence, I saw it fully. He had expected the test to confirm something. If not poison, then at least ambiguity strong enough to justify distance. He had not expected exoneration, and he certainly had not expected me to respond without emotional collapse. Because if I had cried, pleaded, protested loudly, he could have framed that too. Instead, I remained steady, which left him exposed. The final fracture didn't happen during confrontation. It happened when he asked almost casually, "So we're fine now, right?" And I realized he genuinely believed that the absence of chemical evidence erased the presence of accusation. Too late to fix it. Because trust is not measured by lab results. It is measured by what someone is willing to believe about you when the evidence is incomplete. And he had been willing to believe, or at least perform belief, that I could be dangerous. There is no undoing that, only consequence. The conversation happened on a Sunday afternoon. No raised voices, no dramatic tension, just daylight through the living room windows and the quiet awareness that something needed to be said clearly. Adrian was sitting across from me, laptop closed for once. He looked tired, not physically ill, just diminished. "I don't understand why you're still distant," he said. "The test cleared everything." I folded my hands in my lap, steady. "The test cleared chemicals," I replied, not implications. He exhaled sharply. "You're making this bigger than it was." "No," I said calmly. "You made it bigger when you allowed it to exist." He frowned. "I was scared." "I know." That surprised him. "I know you were scared," I continued. "But fear doesn't justify narrative construction." "I didn't construct anything." "You allowed people to believe I was influencing your reputation. Then you allowed the possibility that I was influencing your health." Silence. "You never defended me," I added, not accusing, just stating. He shifted in his seat. "I didn't accuse you. You didn't protect me." That landed. In compliance work, there's a principle. If you are in a position of authority and you allow misinformation to circulate unchecked, you are responsible for its impact. Marriage is no different. He leaned forward, voice lower now. "What do you want from me?" It wasn't defiance. It was confusion. I said slowly, "for you to say immediately and clearly that I was not capable of harming you, even when the data was incomplete." He didn't respond, because he hadn't done that. He had paused, hesitated, left the room. And in that room, suspicion had grown. "I needed you to trust my character before the lab results," I continued. "Not after." He looked at the floor. "I didn't think it would go that far. It went as far as you let it." There was no yelling, no tears, just truth placed carefully between us. After a long silence, he said something almost fragile. "I thought if it turned out to be something real, I'd need to protect myself." There it was, self-preservation. "I understand protecting yourself," I replied. "I've been doing it quietly for months." He looked up sharply. "What does that mean?" "It means I won't be continuing this marriage." The sentence was steady, unemotional, final. His face didn't register anger first. It registered disbelief. "You're leaving me over a misunderstanding?" "No," I said gently. "I'm leaving because of what you were willing to misunderstand." That was the only sharp sentence I allowed myself. He stood, paced once, then stopped. "This is extreme." "No," I said again. "It's proportional." Because trust is the foundation. And once someone has considered you capable of harm without evidence, and let others consider it too, you are no longer safe in that structure. "I never meant to hurt you," he said quietly. "I believe you," I replied. And that was the truth. He didn't set out to destroy me. He set out to protect himself. But in doing so, he revealed something irreversible. The confrontation ended not with drama, but with paperwork. I handed him a folder. Financial separation documents. Consultation notes. A draft agreement. Prepared. He stared at it. When did you do this? While you were waiting for the test results. Silence. This time not fragile. Final. The divorce was not loud. There were no contested assets, no public unraveling, no dramatic allegations were exchanged in court. Just signatures, dates, division, efficiency. If you had watched from the outside, you might have assumed we simply grew apart. That would have been easier to explain. But what actually happened was more precise. I recalibrated my understanding of safety. I moved into a smaller place overlooking Lake Union, not as an escape, but as a reset. The view is quiet in the mornings. Water has a way of reflecting truth without distortion. People sometimes ask me now gently, do you regret leaving? I don't. Not because I hate him, I don't. Not because I believe he was malicious, I don't. But because I learned something essential. Character is revealed most clearly in moments of incomplete information. When evidence is pending, when fear is present, when uncertainty tempts you to assign blame. He chose to leave room for suspicion about me. I chose to close that room permanently. I still work in compliance, still document meticulously, still value calm over chaos. But I no longer confuse quiet with accommodation. There's a difference. Before, I believed that being steady meant absorbing instability, that patience meant allowing time to correct distortions. Now I understand that patience must have boundaries. Silence can be powerful, but it must be chosen, not imposed. The experience didn't make me harder. It made it clearer. I speak sooner now when something feels misaligned, not emotionally, not aggressively, just directly. And perhaps the most unexpected change is this. I no longer worry about being underestimated, because I've seen what happens when someone mistakes restraint for weakness. It isn't a weakness. It's capacity. And capacity, when redirected, becomes independence. Sometimes I think about that kitchen table, the printed toxicology report, the way he said, I don't know what to believe. I do. I believe that trust should precede proof. I believe that love should default toward protection, not self-preservation at someone else's expense. And I believe that when someone shows you the version of yourself they are willing to consider dangerous, you should believe them, not about who you are, but about who they are. I am still calm, still reflective, still deliberating. But now when I look in the mirror, I don't see someone harmless. I see someone who understands the difference between being quiet and being silent on purpose. If you've listened this far, you might be waiting for a dramatic lesson. There isn't one. No villain was unmasked in a courtroom. No public apology was delivered. No reputation was theatrically restored. What happened instead was quieter. Incomplete data created doubt. Doubt created distance. Distance revealed character. And when the full truth arrived, when the toxicology report came back clean, it didn't repair what had already been exposed. Because the real issue was never chemistry. It was trust. When someone you love is faced with uncertainty, do they lean toward protecting you or protecting themselves? Do they close ranks around your character, or do they leave space for suspicion if it benefits them? That week taught me something I carry into every relationship now. You learn who someone is not when the evidence is clear, but when it isn't. And here's the part that matters most. Justice doesn't always look like punishment. Sometimes it looks like clarity, like quiet preparation, like walking away without shouting. My husband accused me of poisoning his reputation until the toxicology report came back. The results exposed who had really been playing a dangerous game, not with chemicals, with narrative. And narrative, when mishandled, can be more corrosive than anything found in a lab. If you've ever been subtly reframed, if you've ever felt someone quietly repositioning you in a story you didn't write, what did you choose? Did you confront it immediately? Or did you wait for the truth to surface on its own? I'd genuinely like to know, because sometimes the most powerful response isn't loud at all. It's simply deciding you will never again stay in a room where your character is negotiable.
Video hữu ích, hãy ấn like và đăng ký kênh để ủng hộ mình nhé. Chúng ta sẽ gặp nhau ở những video tiếp theo. Bye bye.